What's happening, everybody, and welcome to episode 15 of DailyDevClub for Friday the 1st of June. Today we're going to build on the player damage stuff we added in yesterday's episode, and we're going to make the enemies able to shoot projectiles back at the player. So you'll have to dodge the enemies themselves and their projectiles while trying to shoot them. So it'll make the game that little bit more interesting and more difficult, and add an additional element of danger, which should be interesting. So without much further ado, let's get into the code. Okay, so for our projectiles, if we have a quick look at how it works with the player at the minute. In here we have our fire button that gets detected, and our check for time between projectiles to make sure we can't fire them too regularly. And then it instantiates the projectile, sets the position and rotation, and then obviously from there the actual projectile itself handles the movement and then the collisions. So what we want is the same thing on the enemy. So we're going to need a reference to, in the same way we have it here with our projectile. That's our projectile prefab. We need the same thing on the enemy. So game object projectile, and we'll go to our enemy prefab. And in there we see that has that in there, and we will pop that over to there. So now it has a reference to the projectile as well. We're using there. We don't need. Oh no, okay, that's right. Yeah, so that's set. I was just thinking that's not set over here, but that's from our create enemy here. We're setting that dynamically to our player as the enemies are created, so that makes sense. Okay, cool. So that's it. That's why that's empty. Each enemy that's created gets that set to the active player objects. They have a reference. They know where to turn to, which will be useful in a minute when they need to know how which direction to shoot in as well. So we have our reference to our player prefab in our enemy projectile prefab. Sorry. And so in our update, we're going to want to instantiate a projectile. We'll handle when exactly we do that in a minute, but for now, instantiate projectile, and we will. We need to do is so the rotation we can do based on the enemy rotation, which is fine. I think that will make sense. That will still be in the right place. Yeah, we'll lose that bit for the minute. We don't do that. So let's see that. So they're going to just fire projectiles, every frame, which is going to get a bit crazy. So let's have a quick look at that. It should be fun to look at anyway. Very interesting. So the enemies effectively destroyed themselves immediately. Now that's because they're instantiating the projectile, and then it's colliding with themselves, the same as we had with the player. And obviously we can't just pop that in enemy clone and skip it, because when the player fires a projectile, we want that to score. So essentially now we need the idea of a projectile having a parent. And so when we create the projectile, if we set the game object as the parent, and then in our collision, what we'll basically say is if it has a collision with its own parent, then we'll skip it. And that way the projectiles created by the player won't trigger collisions with the player, and the the projectiles created by the enemies won't trigger collisions with the enemies. And so in our player, we need to make sure we set that. In our fire here, we instantiate the projectile, and we will set the get component projectile, and we will set the parent to be this.game object. And we're then going to do the same on the enemy when they instantiate it. So now it has a reference to its own parent, basically, the person that fired it, the thing that fired it. and it should stop it from colliding. Whoa. Okay, so that got out of hand pretty quickly. So we want to make sure that they can't fire constantly. So we need, similar to what we have here with the player, which was a time since last projectile, so the player can't choose to hit the button. But obviously for the enemy, we don't want it to just be every 3 seconds they fire, every 3 seconds. It would be really predictable. So we need to randomize it slightly. So if we actually have it so that every time they fire a projectile, so let's move this into its own method to keep it nice and tidy. And what we'll do is we'll say time until next projectile. That will make most sense, I think. And then we'll randomize it. So if we have ourselves a new variable, and we'll call it time until next projectile, and we'll set that to be that. And then we'll say if time until next projectile is less than or equal to 0, then we fire projectile. And after we fire the projectile, we will reset the time until next projectile to a random number between, let's say, 0, well, not 0 because it might then be immediately sometimes. So let's say between 2 and 5 seconds. So in that way, they're going to fire randomly between that range, and it shouldn't be as predictable. And then obviously what we need is to make sure that this is reduced by the delta time, so the time since the last frame, as we've done in a few other places. So that gets reduced each time. So essentially, obviously, and we can say that maybe set that initial value to 4 seconds. That's hard code. So they won't fire anything for 4 seconds. That will get reduced because it's not less than or equal to 0. It will get reduced by the frame time each time for 4 seconds. Once 4 seconds has passed, it'll fire a projectile, and then the next one will be random. So, and actually maybe that first one will make random as well. Otherwise, so at the minute, if we have a player that we're going to see this, all the enemies will fire after 4 seconds in unison, and then they'll randomize. Now, interestingly, they're shooting each other. Because we added the check for the parent, they're not, the projectile isn't colliding with themselves, but they are able to kill each other. So we need to sort that out as well, don't we? Okay, so let's pop that a random in here, and we'll make that first one. We'll give the player a little bit more of a breather to begin with, maybe too long, 3 seconds and 6 seconds to begin with. So they'll be random, and then from there it'll be between 2 and 5 seconds. So in our collision, what we'll do is we'll check the name instead of the actual game object instance, and that's because they will have the same name. So obviously, if our parent is an enemy object, even if the collision isn't with the same enemy object, the names will match, and it won't actually action. It won't do our logic for that collision when it registers. And hopefully, these enemies won't be able to shoot each other anymore. Okay, there we go. So they're not destroying each other now. So we see. Now, interestingly, we haven't actually had to do anything. You see, our player is already fading out. Let's just check the console. When we get shot. Okay, so let's deal with that. So we're getting an error there. Projectile line 43. Okay, and that's because our projectiles now can hit not just enemies. So this is pulling out the enemy to do a hit, but actually it's not just enemies that can be hit. So this is getting this far when it's hitting the player. So we need to sort of heavily modify this now, because obviously also when the player is getting hit by an enemy projectile, the score still getting incremented. So we are going to need to sort of split this up. We want the projectile to be destroyed either way when it has a collision, that's fine, but the rest is going to be dependent on what it hits. So the best thing to do might now be to sort of split out some of the common logic we have on the enemy and the player into a new script that we apply to both prefabs. So what we will do is we will create ourselves a new script in here, and let's call it damageable. And in our damageable script, we are going to pull out the bits we wanted in here, so being hit from an enemy, and we want those lives, the live variable as well. Score, right, that's only being used in there as well, yeah. So that's our configuration, and then the last bit was setting the lives left properly, isn't it? In our start. Okay, so we pull that out of the enemy now, and popped it in here. And so this particular script now handles having a configurable set of lives, toggling those lives down when they have a hit, and destroying the game object when they run out of lives, and then when that happens, returning the score to be added on. So we need to make sure we add that to our enemy prefab now. And that's the nice thing about the sort of the composition component way of doing things. Obviously, rather than having a prefab, an object made up of one script that does everything for us, we can actually now start to sort of give an object different responsibilities with individual scripts, and each one handles a sort of smaller piece of the puzzle. So we have our enemy script up here on our enemy prefab, and what we also want to do is add a component which is going to be our damageable script. Okay, we've got an error there. Oh, that's where I was randomizing the enemy projectiles, wasn't it? So we'll set that in start. We can't do that up there, we'll just pop that in there. Okay. Wait for that to compile. So we're getting an error now in our projectile because we're getting the enemy component and trying to call hit on it, and so we don't want that component anymore. What we want is the damageable component. Let's see if that compiles now, and then we can finish setting up the config side of it. There we go. So on our enemy prefab, we have our damageable script. We've got 1 life and 10 score for that normal enemy, and we can see that the enemy, we don't have that configuration anymore. Obviously, when we go to the, where are we, prefabs, and we want that tough enemy, let's drag that across as well, because they were, that's why the tough enemies weren't shooting. Okay, cool. So we need to set up the projectile there, and then we need to add the damageable script to this one. And again, we can configure this separately, so we have 3 lives and 50 score for killing them. And then we can add in that same damageable script to our player, because the logic itself is the same, except here we want our lives to be 100, so 100 hit points, and the score doesn't really matter because obviously the score is only when we're destroyed. And you know, we're not keeping track of the enemy score. We're only interested about our own player score. So that's working now. We have our damage. The projectiles even knock us back a bit, which is quite nice. We've got a sort of free bit of physics in there from having these rigid bodies. But we can see that the only problem we have really is that we have our health on the player based on when we bump into the enemies and things like that, that then fades out our character and makes the pointer red, is separate to our 100 lives for being hit. So we need one measure of health, one amount of lives to the player, and that is to get damaged and hit in the same way each time. So if we go back to the player, and with our collisions, we're going to want to make sure that this affects the damageable side of things, and then we need to move the logic that has the sort of user feedback into our damageable script maybe. And then we can base it based on the lives, and then we'll have the added bonus of the enemies actually. So obviously if they have 1 life it won't make much difference, but if they have 3 or 5 or 10 sort of hit points, lives, then as that reduces they too will change colour and reduce it. We can see that visually. So by making that logic common we can see that on both of them, so that would be quite cool. Let's do that. So let's pop that in its own method, update status, let's call it. Just make sure that's going to work for both. We'll lose the debug for now. So they all have sprite renders, that's fine, and we're reducing the colour, which we're then using for the colour and the alpha, and keeping that red constant. Okay, cool. So we'll call that in here. Let's call that visual status. So that'll affect any damageable component now. And then our player, if we're colliding with the enemy, then we're going to want to apply like a hit of some kind anyway on the in here. So we can call that directly. We can replace this simply with this dot get component damageable, and then call hit. So the other thing is we were reducing the health for a hit like that by 5 rather than 1. But I'll tell you what, let's leave that, and maybe we'll switch from sort of the health to lives. So rather than 100 hit points, we'll have 10 lives or something like that. These are the kind of things you need to obviously put in place, and then you can play it. You want to make sure that the balance is right in terms of the difficulty. You know, you don't want necessarily to die in 1 hit, but you don't want it to be too easy and basically be practically bulletproof compared to the enemies. So we'll do that, and then we'll be able to play it and test it and refine it from there. We can lose that now. The only thing we need to do now is actually still have a hook in for stopping the game, which is obviously only needs to happen when the player is dead effectively or destroyed. So, and on the projectiles we're incrementing the score, but we don't want to increment these scores when it's an enemy object. So there's a couple of sort of strands of this logic that only happens when it's a player shooting an enemy, or only happens when it's an enemy shooting a player. So let's see. We don't want to do that every time. We only want to do that when it is a player. And again, I'm just going to avoid hard coding the check for a name or something like that in there. And also creating a new enemy. So that's all stuff that only has to happen when it's an enemy that's been destroyed. We might have to hard code those in, I guess. At least that might be the simplest way for now. We can't use a direct reference to the objects. Like I say, obviously with the enemies you can have multiple different instances of them, so it'll only match if it's the same reference. Now we're using prefab. So okay, so let's think about this then. So we have our damageable. We're sort of logging it as a hit. And then the score is only if they're destroyed effectively. I mean, I guess one way to deal with that is obviously to set the score on our player prefab to 0, because we don't want to assign any score for that. Obviously, the enemy's not interested in collating a score, and then that will mean that even when it's destroyed, it won't be greater than 0, and so it won't toggle that. So that's fine. So now it's really just on this one, it's making sure that we only have those points for hitting an enemy when it is actually an enemy. Rather than when it's an enemy hitting us. So rather than working the collision, maybe we do parent dot name. So we only want to assign a score if the parent is the player, don't we? Game manager dot. Oh, actually that's true. So we could do when the parent equals the. Okay, so actually if we expose the active player, so we have that as an internal variable here. But if we actually make that public, and then on our projectile we can do game manager.active player. So if the parent is the active player, so if the parent of the projectile is the player, and we cause a collision, then we can increment the score for that hit for 5, and then we're going ahead and going through the rest of our sort of core logic for the damageable side of things. Okay, over to the player collision then, and this is for when we're bumping into an enemy. We still have reference to the game manager, so I guess we can say we just want to make sure it's not a projectile, don't we, basically? So we're doing a hit there, and then we want to here, if we just expose the health, or the lives left, so we make that public, I guess, so we can check that. Okay, and then here in our player, left is less than 0, then we can stop the game. So then we're making sure that we're only bumping into enemies. If we are, we're getting our player component damageable, our player damageable component. We're registering the hit. And then we are saying if lives left is less than 0, less than or equal 0, then we're stopping the game. Okay. So that should work, I think. Let's have a quick look and see how that plays, if we've missed anything out. Okay, what else? Health remaining. Okay, yeah, so our damageable update is going to go on the lives left, and we're not assuming 100 now, so it's going to be based on the total amount of lives and the amount of lives left. Divided by lives times by the amount of lives left. And that should work for all of them. Let's have a look and see. So we can see there we're taking damage. We can see the visual impact of that, which is good. Let's try and get some of these bad boys in there. Let's see if we can. It's actually getting quite difficult now. Right. Yeah, so we can see that the visual sort of status of the health is working for the enemies as well. Now, interestingly, because obviously we were checking the enemy names, the enemies can shoot the tough enemies and vice versa because the names don't match. So they can sort of have friendly fire. Let's see if that's working without just the bumping in. That seems to be working too. Yeah. So that seems to work. Okay, now we just have an issue if we're, let's see, a missing reference there. Enemy 24. Okay, so active player is destroyed. So it should be set to inactive, so I'm guessing our check in here for our player isn't working. Okay, and that will be because obviously that works if we're bumping into the player because it's the collision on the player, but actually if it's the projectile that destroys the player here, then it's not stopping the game at that point. So what we can do is we can move this to update, so it's actually checking every frame if we've been destroyed. Which might make most sense. So in here, before we do anything else, we're going to check our damageable component, and if we've got no lives left, we'll stop the game. And we will pop this in as a private variable, so we're not having to look that up every frame. Damageable. We'll look that up once at the beginning. When our object first gets created, we'll find our damageable component, we'll cache that, and then we can reference that, and then every frame it's going to check and stop the game if our lives left are less than or equal to 0. So then that means here we're just obviously making sure we only bump into enemies, which again needs some refinement because that won't work for tough enemies. So what would be quite good is if we could check, to see if it has the enemy component, because obviously all the enemies will have that script attached, but we just don't necessarily want to do that on every collision, or we need to find a performant way to do that really. Maybe we could check a tag or something like that, I think. So we'll come back to that. But we're calling the hit on the damageable. That's doing what it needs to do in terms of keeping track of these lives and updating the visual status. And so all of our damageable logic now is in the one place, which is good. And then the projectiles is doing the same thing here. Destroying the projectile, incrementing the score if it was the player that shot the projectile, and then handling the damageable there, which is quite good. Cool. Okay, let's try that, see if we can avoid that error now with the player being destroyed. Okay, let's just make that round time a bit longer so we can test the actual damage. And on the player, let's have a few less lives. Where are we at? Lives. 20. So that's deactivated the player, but it's not stopped the game. So I think that's the same problem. Let's have a look at the line, 24. Yeah. So maybe move this into the damageable then, so as soon as it happens, we can toggle it so we sort of say if this game object is equal to, do we have a reference to the game? We don't have a reference to the game manager there, that's the thing, is it, to get the active player. We could do it in the projectile. The options, we can at least trap it in here so that if the where is it? So the enemy in the update, we will do if player equals null return. So that at least traps it then, and it may well be then that our other logic kicks in. Let's have a look. Let's avoid the error, but that's still not triggering on our player. Oh, I just took it out, that's why. Okay, that was clever. There. And just to be sure, let's log that out, lives left. Make sure that's definitely where we should be. See in the console our lives left is being reduced. Interesting, so it never hits, it never gets as far as 0. So that must be because it's being set to, is it being destroyed or set to inactive? Let's have a look at the hierarchy. So it's being destroyed. So in damageable, when the lives left, it's destroying it. And of course, there's then no logic to actually handle the stopping of the game then. Okay, so I think maybe the best way to handle this is probably actually to have configuration on the damageable, and we'll say have a toggle that says stop game on destroy. So we'll default that to false, and then our logic that was in here, we will pop in here. So we'll then say if stop game on destroy, and we need a reference now to that game manager. Game manager equals, where are we at? That one. Actually, if we're going to do that, we can actually then, with the reference to the game manager, we can check that it's the player. Actually, that'd be easy, wouldn't it? So we don't have to bother with that at all. Actually, we'll just say if this dot game object equals game manager dot active player, then game manager dot stop game. Otherwise, we'll destroy the object, which is then an enemy. That makes more sense. In here, we don't have to worry about that now. Okay, let's try that one this time and see how that does for us. Okay, so that works nicely, and if we're running into the players, enemies, that works as well. Okay. Okay, so it's definitely made it a lot more challenging now. We have enemy projectiles in there. We can take damage by hitting them, we can take damage by being shot, and likewise for them. And we have a visual sort of status indicator of our damage. So now it's not just about running down the time and the score, it's about survival as well. Okay, so a quick look, we're still getting an error, so player 62, that's a reference to something getting destroyed, I think. Some trapping in there then, if that's null and still firing, and on this one projectile 35. Making sure that's not being destroyed by the time we get to process it. Okay. Okay, so the only other thing to do would be to tidy up our code in there to avoid having to hard code that enemy bit. So if we go to, if if we add a new tag, project settings, let's see if we can use tags for this. Tags and layers. Tag enemy. And then we can also make sure that our enemies can't shoot each other as well this way. So if we do that, open prefab, enemy tag, and we'll do the same thing for our tough enemy. And then let's just have a quick look. Tag, there we go. That's going to be a string. So if the tag is enemy, then we'll have damage. That means that even if we bump into the tough enemies, we'll still take damage. And up here, so that's fine. We still want that parent check to make sure the projectiles can't hit the parents. If the parent is the active player, increment the score. Okay. And this we only, so I know we set the score to 0 for when the player gets hit, so effectively the enemy gets 0 score for hitting the player. So this shouldn't trigger, but just to be sure, let's put in a proper check here now where we say tag equals enemy. So that'll only work if the colliding object was or is an enemy. Then it'll increment the score for the player and create a new enemy. So that's tidied that up quite a bit, which is good. We don't have any sort of hard-coded, we have hard-coded tags, but that's fine because they're reusable rather than having to worry about different object names and clones and the rest of it. Let's just make sure that still works then. Okay, it's quite challenging now to avoid the projectiles and avoid all the enemies, so yeah, a lot harder now, and actually feels more like a proper game now where we've actually got some element of risk and danger with the player being destructible. Okay, and so along similar lines where we had the hard-coded reference to the active player in here for stopping the game, we can actually change that to be a tag as well, so we don't have to expose that on the game manager. So if we go to our project settings, we'll add another tag in for the player. Let's try that again, didn't work. Oh, maybe there already is one actually. Let's have a look. So on our player prefab, open prefab tag, player, yeah. Okay, so we've got that tag set up, and so in the places that we need to, so in the enemy I don't think we reference that, no. In damageable we do, so we can just say if this game object.tag equals player. Once we've been hit, left with less than or equal to 0 lives, we stop the game. And then in not that one, projectile as well, wasn't it? So again, we can say if the parent game object.tag equals player. So similar to how we're doing the check for the enemy then as well. And in that way, we then don't need to make our active player here public. You know, obviously sometimes we do have to expose things like that to access them elsewhere, but it's always just sort of worth thinking about and refactoring sometimes when we don't necessarily need to expose things whether we actually do or not. So once we added the tag for the enemy, it just made sense to do the same thing and use the similar sort of consistent checks for the player as well. And obviously having that tag on there will mean we can use that in other places, which will be handy. Just make sure that still works. Yep, that seems to work nicely. Yep. So that just stops us having to expose that when we don't need to, and makes that slightly easier. In our code with the player tag and the enemy tag, that obviously works across the different types of enemies as well. So, okay, so we've added our second type of player damage, with the enemies able to shoot projectiles back at the player. They're definitely sort of upping the difficulty in the game now, and making things more interesting. So each feature we add sort of feels like it's making it more and more of an actual game, which is great. Next time out in this project, I think we'll look at improving the graphical side of things, so looking at maybe some particle effects and some simple shaders to jazz things up a bit. So we'll look at that next week. But I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Have a great weekend, and I hope to see you all back here next week for the next episode of Daily Dev Club. Peace out! Hope you enjoyed that episode of Daily Dev Club. If you'd like to see another one, click this link right here. Suggestions and feedback are always welcome down below in the comments, please. And of course, if you want to know when the next episode drops, please smash that subscribe button.